Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's Pivot Artist Interview. Today we're talking to Elroy Natachu Jr., Zuni artisan, and we're really excited to be talking with you, so we'll jump right in.
But my name is Elroy Natachu Jr. I'm 29 years old. I've been studying the textile field for 10 years, and I've been painting for the same duration. It just depends on what I'm interested in at the moment. Sometimes I get bored of one subject, jump to another one, and wait until my creative juices are finally ready to attack a certain type of art form, then I'll go from there.
Awesome. I'm just going to jump straight into questions. How did you first join the Pivot Show?
Through Candace, actually. Originally with my kind of awkward schedule with religious obligations and having to do a little bit of work on the side, she was introduced first to Dwayne through art shows, and she was asked first to actually be a part of the exhibit, which I believe was at the tattoo blend. But due to constant nagging, she finally got me in there. I decided, okay, let's see how this goes, because we've never dealt with skateboards in particular. We predominantly were doing fine arts at the moment, but it was just something interesting to work with just based on texture and this movement that the skateboard gives to a certain art piece creates that sort of modernism and that dynamicism that sometimes isn't really conveyed within a flat 2D surface like a canvas or something of that nature.
So building off of that, we know what Dwayne and Landis think of Pivot, what Pivot means to them. What does Pivot mean to you as an artist?
For me in particular, it's nice to see, even though it's similar to paintings in itself, the movement that these skateboards actually give to in particular pieces is a lot more in the now, as a lot of people like to call it, but it sort of gives it a different feel and interpretation to it. It's something that bridges both the contemporary with the traditional, and if, within the exhibit itself, it's numerous people from the entire Southwest region, and their viewpoints are totally varied upon one another, depending on maybe upbringing, cultural influences, or modern day influences. It's a melting pot of voices that each one has their own validity, and it creates this sort of community, but also understanding. And I always am of the belief that art is the true gateway to the soul. It's sort of that, when I think of art, it's sort of that prayer system that's always intact. It's something that's from you that's given onto the masses. And like all art, it's subjective and it's up for interpretation, but that's what makes art so wonderful, that it can reach people at different levels depending on if it just looks pretty or if they have some personal connection to it. It's that pathway of that interconnectivity of experiences, and it just makes understanding things a lot more easier rather than just talking about it. You can actually have visual aids and interpretation, and that's what's great about this exhibit. And what Pivot for me sort of symbolizes is that togetherness and that creativeness that's just thrust upon the world, because everybody's been following this, and it's something to inspire not only the youth but the regular everyday folk that just need a little bit of a cheer up in their lives.
Yeah. And how did you first get into art?
I've always been very artistic as a child. So I learned how to cook at a very young age, and I was always into yarn, doing embroidery and things like that. It's only when I actually went into middle school when we started taking more of our class trips. And in Zuni Pueblo, we do have the church of I believe it's the, I forget which church, but it's the Catholic Church, where the inside is actually has a lot of murals done by an artist named Alex Yautua. He was predominantly a China artist, and his artwork based more on that realism. And then with one of my late relatives, Dwayne Dishta, he was more on the very sort of detail orientated, but very semi-realistic paintings. From those two, I was heavily influenced, and it just kind of took off from there. That those seeing those and where they can go with their art heavily influenced myself at a very young age, and um, it just sort of was a hobby at first until I went to university, where I just had to study things like modern art and contemporary art, and it threw me out of my comfort zone, but in a good way, to where it elevated my art to where I was basically copying or interpreting their viewpoints, but when I was influenced by people like Jackson Pollock with his use of splatter work, Van Gogh with his use of color theory. Just these different contemporary and old artists is what kind of pushed me to push my art in a new direction. When you look at Zuni art, it's kind of all the same. There's either pottery, landscapes, kachinas, but they kind of all look the same, or they can kind of be grouped in one category. When I started doing my art, it was kind of not well received at some points because it was so different. But then again, it was received well because it was different. So you always get those two sides the coin. It's something that us as artists have to deal with. But once I got out of university, that's when me and Candace kind of took over the whole art show circuit, because our parents used to be a part of that, and Candace's parents are still a part of that. And as we went into different fields, I was more in the art-based field. Candace went more into a field where she didn't want nothing to do with art at the moment. And I dragged her along, and I basically crammed all of 6 years of art history and schooling into 6 months of a hardcore boot camp to kind of get her to a point where if I couldn't make an order, she could replicate it without any sort of disturbances in the artwork form. And then from there, after training for about 4 years, sort of the cutoff process from that particular style into creating more of her style. So it's sort of break you down and then build you up from there. That's how we were taught as we were growing up. And even in the university system, it's the same way. They break you down to build you up, but it makes you a lot more better in the end.
Well, it's you're wearing one of your t-shirt designs, and I can see the combination of like your influence and Candace's influence in that. It's fun to see all of your work and both of your work together on the Instagram. So we'll be shouting that out later, but it's fun to hear about how you guys did that together.
Yeah.
So my question is, and you kind of got into it, but you know, this has been a difficult time. You and I were talking about Santa Fe Indian Market and doing it online and judging.
Yeah.
We're dealing with the pandemic. We're dealing with a lot of cultural stuff. But
Yeah.
what does art mean to you in this kind of time period and when you're dealing with these kinds of challenges?
That's a tough question. It kind of varies. The reason why we continued art even in this kind of depressing times, because both Candace and I have been affected not only by those in our family affected by COVID or our family and friends. It's for me, it's a gateway to sort of calm my mind to where it helps with that mental aspect of a healthy mind sort of thing. But it's been uplifting because since everybody, and particularly here in Zuni, were on restriction, it's made it to where it's given people kind of like a brim of hope for that we're still continuing, and that as we were very young, we were brought up very strict, so we were taught not to give up, and it's something that we always strive for, to make others happy rather than ourselves. And that's one thing that's always been instilled at a very young age, is that we kind of don't work for ourselves in particular, we work for everybody at whole, because our cultural sort of practices, they kind of taught us that it's not the individual, it's the whole. So if we take care of one another, we're able to support one another, and in turn, they'll be able to support you. That's why we've never sort of wanted anything to be individualistic. We wanted it to be more towards the masses. And that's why we've always tried to make our artwork affordable.
So you've kind of touched on this in some of your previous answers, but maybe we could have you speak more directly to this. What does being a native artist mean to you? And like, how does Zuni influence your work? And how do you feel like maybe you're influencing, you know, the progression of how that artwork is forming?
For me in particular, being a Native American artist, it's sort of allowing our voices to be heard, especially in this sort of time. Beforehand, especially with trading posts and things like that, we were always told what our artwork is worth and what it's valued at, especially within Zuni in particular. I work for an arts cooperative here. We're the only Native American art-based cooperative in the state of New Mexico. We've always had the struggle of having people like jobbers or trading posts dictate what our art is valued at, what if it's worthy enough to be sold. But as artists, the community in particular, we need sort of that mentality of helping one another. The trading post system kind of created was that animosity, where ancestrally we were always cooperating with one another, helping each other, teaching each other new techniques. It's only when things like money, just because their name may be more well known or sought after, as far as what's interesting about the way we sort of look at the whole being a native artist is it's our chance value, is because a lot of times, especially with the younger generation, with the things of technology and things like that, sometimes value is already based in what they see, but not sort of that internal value of who they are. And that's kind of a viewpoint that I started to learn at a very young age, because I was born with a malformed left hand. So I was always that sort of outsider looking in. But when you grow up in that perspective, it sort of gives you an understanding of people, because you're more observant to the nuances of how people react to certain things, or how they treat each other. Or it's sort of that mentality of that westernization and that colonization sort of aspect to different things that always come up. But when people talk about living in a traditional world or the white man's world, it's not really that in particular. It's a mindset that a lot of people have. It's not, oh, traditional one day, then I'm modern the next day. It's a mentality that's instilled at like a very young age, because we're never going to go back to how it was a long time ago. And now, at where we're at, a lot of things are missing or have been lost. It was because they didn't get passed down, and that mentality sort of eats away that westernization and colonization, because originally our ancestors always we're warming and welcoming, and we're accepting different things, education, or something as simple as education at the home. The meat and bones of a person is created, is in the home. And that's why I always strive to educate and tell individuals that if something's wrong in your life or something's bad, don't go blaming somebody else. It always starts at the home. It's what you teach to your children. It's what you learn from your ancestors and uncles. That mentality that sort of has to be broken in order to create that understanding. And that's why I try to utilize my artwork to create those talking points or those bridge points, because a lot of people can paint pretty things, but if there's no soul or there's no meaning to a particular piece, it's kind of just lifeless in a way. But if you can instill certain types of memories, teachings, and just create a talking point, that's where it kind of starts. And it's kind of hard, particularly with our younger and older generations being so far from how it was back then when they grew up to how it is now, that it's starting to create these rifts within not only our culture, but within the family systems themselves. So as a Native artist, for me, it's about bridging those gaps and trying to create continuity and connectivity instead of animosity or things for fame's sake. In our belief and mentality, if it's going to happen, it will happen. If you're blessed with it, you'll be blessed with it. It's not something that you should strive for. Just keep practicing what you do, and more on that mentality of practice what you preach kind of concept.
Thank you for that thoughtful answer. So we're down to our last question here, and we've talked about your art kind of generally, but one of the things that we're excited about is your textile work. So wondering if you could tell us how you got into doing textile work and maybe just a little bit about that background.
Yeah, for textiles, as I was saying before, I've been in it for about 10 years. I started out very young, and that was usually just spinning, rolling yarn. As a kid, I would always ask tons of questions. I would never stop asking questions, because in order to learn, you don't ask a question, you're not going to get an answer, or nobody, and to always not trust one answer. Ask multiple people and see if there's a consensus or a continuity between the both. But when I started from learning from my mother. She was predominantly embroidering things like kilts and stuff like that, and that's how we made ends meet back then, because before we got into the fields that were in textiles, jewelry, the predominant breadwinner within our family was my father, and to help supplement, we would help by creating textile pieces, basic Pueblo stitching, the general format of the kilt, and the patterns were taught to us by our grandparents and other relatives that were in the field, that we learned the basic interpretation. But in order to understand it, you need more viewpoint activities with the high school and the university I used to work for, where I used to interact with Acoma, Laguna, and predominantly through those connections, I met various weavers and talked with them about their upbringings, interpretations. And for textile arts, it's a teaching of that old way, because originally textiles are not really that common within the Southwest. Originally, the base of textiles came from Mexico, where a lot of things were done with a backstrap loom. And from that migration, our ancestors actually Babylonian work was done with yucca fibers or some type of feather blankets and things like that. So those were the baseline for Pueblo textiles. When the Spanish came, embroidery became more prevalent. Although there was some embroidery within around about 780, 180, cotton was present. There isn't really that much information. The textiles were hand painted or either resist dyed or a tie-dye type of method, whereas the formats of them as well were also asymmetrical. They were never geometric or very pristine straight lines as you see like the maiden capes and other types of garments like that. With a lot of Pueblo communities, it's a gender-based occupation. So textiles predominantly were a male occupation, whereas nowadays with westernization, that's deemed as something of a female occupation or a female trait. But originally, the weaving process was done within the kiva systems. And from there, it was a teaching method for our younger male individuals to learn how to not get upset. Or actually, we all had long hair, and if those that don't have long hair and are men, and it's very hot when you're spinning, your hair gets stuck everywhere, and it's just something that sort of forces you to learn to discipline yourself, because it's very easy to get irritated or mad when you're doing textile arts. It's something that teaches them respect and understanding who we are as people, especially in the regard of our matriarchal societies. A female's wardrobe predominantly was only a manta, a maiden's cape, and predominantly for Zunis, a hair tie or the butterfly whorls. But those simple clothing had tons of meaning to them for the sort of upbringing and our migrations. For Zuni in particular, the garment itself links itself directly to how we came out of the underworld. And what's interesting about Zuni culture is we're not like any of the other Pueblos in particular as far as creation stories or other Native American communities. A lot of them, depending on who they are, for Zunis, we always have this understanding and belief. When we came out of that last underworld, our ancestors were very small and tiny, big ears covered in moss. They had tails, scales, and they had no eyelids. And only when we were shaped by our twin war gods that we turned into what we look like today. And there's the basis for our culture within itself, is that we're not born sort of perfect in any way or any shape or form. It's what we choose to do and how we're assisted in life, linking between those that have gone and those that are with us now. Within our textiles, that teaching is embedded in every weave, every stitch. It's a prayer within itself. When we learn how to go into any sort of art form, predominantly textiles, with a heavy heart or a bad mind, because your textile will fight you or something bad might happen. It tests you as an individual, and it's how you interact and how you learn from these hardships that create sort of that well-rounded human being. That's why I always strive for textile teaching and for those to learn about textiles. It's very cumbersome. It takes a lot of time to do for profit almost. I've never met a weaver that's rich. That's one thing that we've always strived for. And my teacher who taught me how to weave belts is of that same mentality, is that his name was Louis Garcia, you'll never find a weaver that actually is rich, no matter what category, no matter what kind of field. Time consuming in itself that it takes months to years just to finish one garment. And if those that purchase it understand just one tiny bit of how much work it takes, we can just go to Walmart and purchase a new shirt, a new something, a new this. But to get something made that's handmade, hand spun, hand woven, has their own interpretation, it takes time. Nothing in life is ever going to be easy or quick. It's always that learning and that movement to something different that pushes us to our limits, but it makes us sort of the finished product. Within our history, when we're born, there's two interpretations. We're either a ball of clay or a piece of meat. And then as we go on, we start to build ourselves up. We start to create new shapes, new things, and patterns are added as we go on. And it's only when we pass away or when we're at our end of our road is when we fully become understanding of how things work. We'll never know how or be an expert at one particular field, no matter how many years we've been in this field. It's something that you're always learning and striving for better, for different things. And it's that mentality that I grew up with, that nothing is going to be easy. You always have to work hard for it. If you don't, there are times where you're going to be so worn out and you just need a little bit of time just to yourself. And that's good, but don't try and stay there too long, because you could get stuck in that sort of spot where your mind plays tricks on you. But if any type of field you're in, it'll work out for the better, and not to dwell on things of the past. The past will always be the past. We can never change what happened. It's more on what can we do for tomorrow, not necessarily for the future, but what can we do for tomorrow, the next day after that. It's something that textiles teach us, is that when we create them with a soul and a life of their own, that they'll have a life similar to ours. They have garments in, whether it be the salvages or the design patterns, you always find that continuity of life and death. Although that it's a hard topic for a lot of people to deal with, it's a commonality and it's natural, and it's not something that we should be afraid of. And that's why I always try to keep that every day as if it was your last day here.
Yeah. We just want to say thank you so much for chatting with us today. We've been looking forward to this since we got to talk to Candace. So it's nice to hear both of your sides of the story of like how you got involved with Pivot and your how your art career kind of took off together.
Yeah.
And your collaboration. So thank you for talking to us, and thanks for everyone who watched. For people watching, you can follow Elroy on Instagram at Natachu_Inc. And on his website at natachuinc.com. See all of the amazing art, all of the different projects, and all of the ways he's an artisan, and all these different wonderful ways. And you can follow Pivot Exhibit on Instagram, as well as us at the Center on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. We want to give a quick shout out to a lot of the people who helped get us Pivot to the Center Southwest Studies and are helping support us currently. Keep it up and let it be finally seen. Some of those people are the LPEA Roundup grant folks, our crowdfunding donors, Richard and Marilyn Ballantyne, the Colorado Humanities Cares grant people, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. It takes a lot of people to put on an amazing exhibit, and we're lucky to have had supporters for that. This is our exciting also news. The much anticipated opening of Pivot is finally here. We're using an online reservation system to set up limited capacity showing appointments, and you have to reserve a spot online to get in. So please don't come to the center as normal. We want to do this safely and have the artwork be viewed in a way that is safe and healthy for everyone in these circumstances. When people are watching this, I don't know what the dates are going to be, but between August 10th and August 15th, We're doing a sneak peek for members only. And then August 17th through the 22nd, we still have our extended hours for the general public. Please, again, make sure to set an appointment online so we know when people are coming. And then after August 24th through December, we'll have general public hours. And please check our website, Instagram, Facebook, or message us directly to figure out what those hours are and how to sign up to see that. Elroy, we really hope we can work with you in the future soon, you and Candace both. And I know we have a lot of things in our collection that I think we'd love to hear your take on and your vantage point. I know you mentioned Dwayne Disht as a relative. I know we have some pieces in our collection that are his. So lots of cool projects that I think we can work with you on. And thank you for talking with us today.